The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, editors Introduction. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is one of those audacious and robust texts for which the term classic could have been invented. Ever since its publication in 1951, the essay has provoked controversy, prompting successive generations of readers to wrestle with the paradox at its core. Many authors might have welcomed such notoriety, but not Max Weber, 1864–1920, who bitterly complained that the critics had misunderstood him and that the ensuing debate was both obfuscating and sterile. To prevent further confusion, he revised the essay in 1919, modifying some of its formulations and increasing further an already massive apparatus of footnotes. But all attempts at definitive clarification were to no avail. Weber's revision, published in 1902, served only to generate new problems and ambiguities. And herein, ironically, lies the secret of the Protestant ethics fame. If Weber's thesis were self-evidently true, simple, or translucent, it would never have engaged a critical audience in the first place or survived to become a classic. Mere solutions to a problem impede a text's ascent to greatness for the simple reason that they offer no challenges for contemporaries to embrace and successors to ponder. Weber's achievement was not to definitively answer a riddle, but to stake out a territory fertile of new puzzles, at the heart of which is the claim that religious forces, not simply economic ones, paved the way for the mentality characteristic of modern Western capitalism. On Weber's account, our secular and materialistic culture is partly indebted to a spiritual revolution, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. That Weber's argument raises or begs 100 questions is inseparable from its eminence and renown. Although key themes of the Protestant ethic were rehearsed by Weber as early as 1884, the essay itself was written in stages between the summer of 1935 and the winter of 1905. Its composition came at a watershed moment. Weber, recovering from a prolonged nervous illness, was once more testing his creative powers. His wife, Marion Nie Schnitger, 1870–1954, was under no illusions about the essay's significance for her husband. She described it as the first work to make Weber's star shine again, and one connected with the deepest roots of his personality. Perhaps this is why he defended it so vehemently, and with a passionate indignation unmatched in all his other scholarly writings. The writings on Protestantism that we present below, particularly the Protestant Ethic, the version of 1905, and its companion piece, Churches and Sects in North America, 1906, condense Weber's deepest interests and commitments, and this is what makes them such intensely personal works. They also abridge a number of themes that go beyond their obvious subject matter. Not least of them is a plea for Imperial Germany to grow up, to cast off a politically authoritarian, outmoded system, dominated by the Junker landed class, and embrace the modern industrial order. Weber located the origins of modern freedom not in the Enlightenment but in the Puritan Anglo-American tradition. The struggle to establish liberty of conscience and worship, he argued, was the cornerstone of all other human rights. The vanguard of that struggle was the Protestant sects, Baptists, Quakers, and others, whose influence in Germany had been eclipsed by the Lutheran Church and its aura of office. Weber acknowledged that Lutheranism began life as a radical movement, but he viewed its trajectory as moving in an increasingly illiberal direction, endorsing state power against individual freedom, and allegedly, like Catholicism, encouraging passive adaptation to existing conditions rather than soliciting innovation and risk. As he confessed in a much-quoted letter to the theologian Adolf von Harnack, written shortly after the Protestant Ethic was completed, Luther towers above all others, but Lutheranism is, I don't deny it, in its historical articulation the most frightening of terrors for me. The fact that our nation never went through the school of hard asceticism, in no form whatsoever, is the source of everything that I hate about it and about myself. I can't help it, but in religious terms the average American sect member surpasses our institutional Christians as much as Luther excels. As a religious personality, Calvin, Fox et tutti quanti. The heartlands of radical individualism, Weber claimed, were to be found in England and America, nations that created not only free institutions, effective parliaments, and responsible and dynamic leaders, but also the capacity for global power politics. In contrast, Weber lamented, Germany was in danger of becoming a laughingstock. Politically rudderless and impotent, crassly dependent on Bismarck's Caesarist, Legacy 9, and at the mercy of Wilhelm II's well-publicized histrionics, Germany lacked the combination of discipline and freedom that the Puritan tradition had vouchsafed to the Anglophone world. However, Weber's writings on Protestantism bear traces not only of the travails of Lutheranism, but also of Bismarck's disastrous struggle against German Catholics, the so-called Kulturkampf, 1871–79, 11, that, under the guise of resisting Catholic obscurantism, tore the nation apart and hastened the decline of German liberalism. It was not that Weber was any great friend of the Roman Catholic Church. On the contrary, he shared the widely held view among Protestant liberals that Catholicism was traditionalist, hostile to progress, and culturally inferior. 12. It was more that, in the aftermath of the Kulturkampf, German Catholics were pressing vocally for occupational quotas, designed to redress the discrimination against them in the civil service and elsewhere. Though Catholics insisted that all they wanted was basic justice, Weber, like many of his contemporaries, interpreted their platform as a demand for preferential hiring. The Catholic drumbeat for parity was not regarded as a universalistic civil rights movement that would, for instance, have included Jews, but as a partisan campaign to establish a system of patronage and spoils, an attack on the idealized neutrality of the civil service and the principle of achievement. This is the context of Weber's opening observations in the Protestant Ethic on the relationship between religious affiliation and social stratification. For while Weber was aware of discrimination against Catholics in Germany, he was convinced, too, that their unequal distribution in the higher strata of economic life was principally a function of cultural orientations and antipathies, themselves a legacy of the Catholic communion. Or to put the matter in another way, that Protestants were successful not simply because of the state's processes of selection, or because of the historic preponderance of Protestants in German cities, but because a community and home environment had fostered the peculiar mentality most suited to business acumen and professional advancement. 14. In such wise, the Protestant ethic was meant as a contribution to a contemporary political debate as much as a contribution to social economics. 15. And economic history. 16. And although received wisdom portrays the text as essentially a reply to Marxian materialism, this was only one, and certainly not the most important, of Weber's concerns. Weber liked to describe himself as religiously unmusical, but he never said that he was tone-deaf. He came from a Protestant family. In particular, his mother, a lasting moral presence in his life, was an earnest and, in her own way, worldly product of a heterodox Southern German Protestant milieu. 17. He was an active participant in the Evangelical Social Congress, ESC 18, to which he was introduced by his cousin Otto Baumgart, founded in 1890 to formulate social policy questions relevant to German workers. Weber attended its conferences until 1897, sat on the ESC's council, wrote for its house journal, Die Christliche Welt, directed under ESC auspices a survey in 1890–93 into the situation of rural laborers east of the Elbe River. 19, and delivered lectures for the ESC on the stock exchange and agrarian social relations. Weber was also a friend and critical advisor of the Protestant reformer Friedrich Naumann. To be sure, Weber's Protestant activism was in its own peculiar way agnostic, not a matter of a faith to be espoused, but above all, though not exclusively, a means to educate the German working class and naive bourgeois culture Protestant in the harsh imperatives of contemporary capitalism. For Weber, the modern world was not about to witness an impending reign of reason or an abundance of Christian compassion. Instead, the future promised a ceaseless global struggle over material resources and alternative modes of life. Only the most industrially competitive, politically dynamic, and assiduously hard-headed nations had a chance of becoming or remaining great powers and great cultures. Given this background, it is perhaps unsurprising that the historical connection between Protestantism and capitalism would emerge as one of Weber's chief preoccupations. But there was even more at stake than we have so far suggested. Marion Weber tells us that her husband, the secular ascetic par excellence, strongly identified with the Puritans of his most famous essay, whose faith and heroism produced a new type of man, entirely dependent upon himself, in terrible solitude and bereft of all magical powers of salvation. No church, no preacher, no sacrament can help him in the decisive matter of his life. 20. Equally, Weber, a man whose precarious emotional conditions sensitized him naturally to suffering and misfortune, was struck by the tragedy of the Puritans' actions. Although he is often cited as a theorist of rationality and rationalization, Weber repeatedly noted that, from the standpoint of individual conduct, history is deeply irrational. Between action and consequence lies a chasm that no one can bridge, let alone control. The Puritans of Weber's story could not know what they were doing. People can only know what they intend to do, and even then their self-knowledge is highly imperfect. More precisely, the Protestant radicals, inspired by a powerful sense of the divine, helped unwittingly to create a social and economic order its pioneers would have seen as godless, materialist, and devoid of any ultimate purpose. Weber, says his wife, was profoundly moved by the fact that on its earthly course an idea always and everywhere operates in opposition to its original meaning and thereby destroys itself. The statement is an exaggeration. Even so, it helps explain the cri de coeur with which the Protestant ethic ends. Weber's acidic indictment of those specialists without spirit, hedonists without a heart 22 whom he feared modern capitalism, was creating in abundance 23 only, for a relatively short time was capitalism animated by the moral purpose of Puritanism that it could, in any case, live quite comfortably without. Either as it increasingly does today, as a fatalistically accepted inevitability, or, as in the Enlightenment period, including modern-style liberalism, legitimated as somehow the relatively optimum means of making, roughly in the sense of Leibniz's theodicy, the relative best of the relatively best of all worlds. But capitalism no longer appears to the most serious-minded people as the outward expression of a style of life founded on a final, single, and comprehensible unity of the personality. And it would be a great mistake to believe that this fact will be without consequences for the position of capitalism within the total culture, firstly for capitalism's effects, but also for its own inner essence, and ultimately for its destiny. Soon after Weber completed the first part of the Protestant ethic in the summer of 1904, he, Marion, and a number of colleagues, including Ernst Troeltsch, Werner Sombart, Ferdinand Tienes, and Paul Hensel, embarked on a trip to America. The German scholars had been invited by the Harvard psychologist Hugo Emmensturberg, formerly of Freiburg University, to take part in the 1904 World Congress of Arts and Science, held in St. Louis. While the formal occasion of the American adventure was academic in a narrow sense, Weber's own lecture for the World Congress, on comparative rural social relations, drew both on his Protestant ethic research and on earlier studies of German peasant labor. 25, the sojourn afforded him the opportunity to visit far-flung relatives and to feel the pulse of modern capitalism, America, for himself. Unchained from his desk, the German Tocqueville was now in a position to see and engage the peoples whose history and destiny were then at the heart of his interests. Hans Rollmann has nicely observed that Max Weber in America reminds one of Camus' Saint without God, except that the saint is hyperactive. 26 And indeed, from the time they arrived in New York Harbor on August 31 until their departure some 2 months later, the Weber's whirlwind itinerary took them from the East Coast to the Midwest to the South and the West, and then back again to the eastern seaboard. New York, Buffalo, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, and Boston all played host to the peripatetic couple who asked questions without respite, eagerly sought out new contacts and contributors to various scholarly projects, and who, more generally, absorbed the remarkable variety of American life. Characteristically, Weber refused to share the stiff opprobrium of those German colleagues for whom America was a linguistic abbreviation for vulgarity, chaos, greed, and human misery. On the contrary, as his friend Troeltsch reported, he was full of admiration for a people of freedom, of industry and promises for the future. Everything contrary is for him only youthfulness and incompleteness, and he considers the most uncanny things to originate as a result of this plenitude of power. His love in the fight and engagement for the individual finds here entire satisfaction. 27 Even Chicago, a veritable hell on earth for many continental visitors, failed to dampen Weber's spirits. In accounts that combine wonder with detachment, Weber describes not only the city's pollution, squalor, violent strikes, shootings, and showcased prostitutes, but also its remarkable mix of ethnic groups and cuisines. His unsqueamish Tay-Lorsk account of one of Chicago's legendary institutions is worth quoting at length. Everywhere one is struck by the tremendous intensity of work, most of all in the stockyards, with their ocean of blood, where several thousand cattle and pigs are slaughtered every day. From the moment when the unsuspecting bovine enters the slaughtering area, is hit by a hammer and collapses, whereupon it is immediately gripped by an iron clamp, is hoisted up, and starts on its journey, it is in constant motion past ever-new workers who eviscerate and skin it, etc., but are always in the rhythm of work, tied to the machine that pulls the animal past them. One sees an absolutely incredible output in this atmosphere of steam, muck, blood, and hides in which I teetered about together with a boy who was giving me a guided tour for 50 cents, trying to keep from being buried in the filth. There one can follow a pig from the sty to the sausage, and the Can 28 Weber's enthusiasm for America is not, however, to be confused with voyeurism or navit. Nor did he direct his questions exclusively to the established savants like Albion Small and William James, whom he encountered on his trip. 29 If Weber was impressed by the New World, he was also disturbed, and his wife even more so, by the human price this experiment in nation-building was exacting. In Chicago itself, the Webers visited Jane Addams's Hull House and witnessed for themselves the plight of the destitute. In Tuskegee, they sojourned to Booker T. Washington's famous educational institution for Negroes. What they found, Marion Weber records, probably moved them more than anything else on their trip. The great national problem of all American life, the showdown between the white race and the former slaves, could be grasped at its roots. 30. Just how seriously Weber took that national problem is shown by his interactions with Northern reformers like Edwin and Caroline Seligman, and his correspondence with Negro leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, whose The Souls of Black Folk, 1903 Weber was keen to see in German translation. Weber also commissioned a paper from Du Bois, whom he visited in Atlanta, on the Negro question in the United States for the Archive für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik, the journal he jointly edited with Werner Sombart and Edgar Jaffe, which appeared in 1906.31, assuring Du Bois of his intention, never redeemed, to return to the South as soon as possible, Weber affirmed. I am absolutely convinced that the color line problem will be the paramount problem of the time to come, here and everywhere in the world. 32 Still, for our purposes, the most significant outcome of Weber's trip was the remarkable essay he penned on churches and sects in North America. Like the Protestant ethic, to which it is a scintillating counterpoint, Weber's essay on the American sects appeared in more than one incarnation. It was published first in 1906 in the German liberal newspaper, the Frankfurter Zeitung, reworked in the same year for Martin Reid's Die Christliche Welt, the version translated here, and then revised once more for Volume 1 of Weber's collected essays in the Sociology of Religion under the title, The Protestant Sects and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1920. 33, the nearest Weber ever got to an ethnography of American life. The essay is notable for its striking account of the relationship between the Protestant sects, business association, and the foundations of American pluralist democracy. At this point, a contrast of the churches and sects article with its more famous cousin is illuminating. We begin with the latter. The 1905 essay on the Protestant ethic, and in the rebuttals of H. Carl Fischer and Felix Rachfal, also translated below, Weber seeks to document how the capitalist spirit, or mentality or philosophy of life Lebensauffassung, or conscious way of conducting one's life Lebensfrung or habitus, he gave it various names, came into being. Central to that spirit is a view of economic activity that is historically novel, radical, and momentous. Consider first what it negated. Traditional per-capitalist attitudes toward work, Weber suggested, tend to see it as a necessary evil, to be expedited solely in order to live, and as part of the never-ending, meaningless cycle of production and consumption. Economic activity is custom-bound, and money or barter is the means to sustain habitual styles of life. Since work has no intrinsic value, laborers, when they are not under the compulsion of others, cease their exertions once their needs are met. The truly important matters of life begin once work has ended. Accordingly, Weber remarks, attempts to boost the productivity of tradition-bound workers by increasing piece rates often backfire. A model of Homo economicus might lead one to assume that the prospect of more money through higher wages would encourage laborers to work harder and be more economically efficient. But then again, Homo economicus is simply a convenient fiction of economic theory. In real life, economic behavior is predicated on what people believe is rational for them, and such interpretations are socially embedded and culturally mediated. As a result, workers steeped in traditional ways of life may view the increased piece rate not as an incentive to become richer by working harder and longer, but simply as a means to reach their customary wage sooner. Having received enough to satisfy their needs, they may then desist from further activity. Similarly, the traditional employer tends to work at a more leisurely pace and is disposed by temperament and constrained by a complex web of social obligations to be conservative in his business methods. In contrast to these traditional attitudes, consider next the mental and moral universe of early capitalist entrepreneurs, as Weber describes it. No longer is work deemed a meaningless chore to be finished as soon as possible. Now it is invested with moral value. For employers imbued with this new spirit, economic activity is an end in itself, central to their identity, a calling with rigorous implications that transgress old ways of doing business. If accustomed lifestyles and normative expectations are disrupted by the imperatives of productivity, calculated risk-taking, innovation, and methodical behavior in which time is at a premium, then so be it. The enterprise is greater and more important than those it employs, the owner its resourceful steward, deferring the temptations of immediate consumption in order to make the organization more fecund and profitable. The priority of work over the worker, of the enterprise over the entrepreneur, means that there is little room here for sentimentality. In order to survive, the firm must constantly reinvest capital and adapt to an impersonal market. In order to flourish, competitors must be eliminated or at least neutralized. Steely objectivity and discipline are the orientations demanded from this godless mechanism. Weber's depictions of both traditional economic activity and its antithetical capitalist spirit are what he calls ideal types, analytic constructs, or models that impute to the fluctuating actions of real people an artificial consistency that is nonetheless useful in highlighting a distinctive pattern of conduct. Ideal types are not pictures or copies of reality. They are one-sided accentuations of it, useful fictions, arrived at on the basis of what the investigator deems culturally significant. 34 That being so, both tradition and the spirit of capitalism are capable of articulations different from the ones that Weber gave them. Weber's own characterization of the spirit of capitalism, which he illustrated copiously with quotations from Benjamin Franklin, sought to reconstruct attitudes and motivations toward work that he believed were uniquely modern. But where had they come from? Weber's precise answer to this question was more evasive than he was willing to admit. But the general thrust of his argument is that the ethos of modern capitalism, that is, its distinctive moral attitudes toward economic activity and work, its methodical, specialized style of life, is historically indebted to caused by, congruent with the Protestant ethic, the ascetic movement that arose out of the Protestant Reformation and its aftermath. Pivotal to that movement was a transformation in attitudes toward worldly affairs. Work gained an unprecedented dignity by being understood as a vocation or calling beruf, ordained by God. The link between Protestant ethic and capitalist ethos, spirit, is one of the most complex aspects of Weber's essay. We return to it in section IV of this introduction. For the moment, readers should be cautioned that the postulated relationship is between two normative constructions. More simply, between two sets of ideas common to which is the notion that work has ethical significance, that it is a duty and obligation to be expedited with maximum rigor and consistency. In Weber's responses to Fischer and Rachfal, he irascibly reaffirms this point, insisting that the object of his essay was not to explain the origins of the capitalist system as such a task that would have required an analysis of its political, legal, and material conditions, but only to examine Protestantism's contribution to aspects of the early capitalist frame of mind and Lebensfreude, the way of deliberately conducting one's life. 35 How this squares with an assertion in the Protestant ethic, reaffirmed in the first of Weber's rejoinders to H. Karl Fischer, that a distinctive economic mentality still characterized late 19th century German Protestant communities, is not altogether clear. Among Weber's most famous claims in the Protestant ethic is the contention that Calvinism constituted the supercharged motivation behind the ascetic movement and its sectarian splinters. The Calvinist doctrine of predestination, according to which all humans are irrevocably either damned or chosen to be among God's elect, posed an agonizing question to the faithful. Were they vessels of God's grace or simply worthless creatures condemned to the unending torment of hell? God's will could not be manipulated or deciphered, but could intimations of his divine purpose for humans be revealed to the faithful? Lacking any palatable answer from Calvin's own theology, Calvinist believers looked to their pastors for help. The support they received was broadly of two kinds. First, believers were counseled to assume that lack of faith in one's being chosen was tantamount to an absence of grace. The faithful were taught they had a duty to regard themselves as members of the elect, and to dismiss any doubts as a temptation from the devil. Second, they were encouraged to assume that tireless labor in a calling was the best possible means of attaining this self-assurance. This enduring crisis of proof, of demonstrating to oneself that one was among the chosen spiritual elite, fashioned a distinctive kind of individual, Weber maintained. Unable to find solace in the sacraments or in the image of a kindly God, aware that their neighbors, even their family, may be among the perpetually condemned, Calvinist believers were psychologically isolated. Their distance from God could only be precariously bridged, and their inner tensions only partially relieved by unstinting, purposeful labor. The result was inner-worldly rational asceticism, rigorous, scrupulous, methodical work within a calling. In Gianfranco Paggi's felicitous summary, the elect is active, not passive. His activity is directed by his intellect, not by habit or feeling. The time span of his attention and his effort is lengthy, not brief. His activity is continuous, not intermittent. He takes charge of his life, does not drift, nor does he trust events to go his way. He plans his existence and takes responsibility for its temporal outcome, does not bless or curse fate. He struggles to impose order and control over the things and people surrounding him, does not allow or expect them to determine him. The individuals who are daily reconstituted by this discipline, Weber concluded, are the vehicles of the rationalizing capitalist spirit, 38, and the forebears of the modern capitalist Berufsmenschen. We can now return to Weber's Churches and Sects in North America, the fruit of his American observations. In that essay, Weber provides a novel twist to his previous argument by examining the manner in which a certain kind of group discipline, as distinct from an ethic and its psychological inducements, nourishes and actively shapes the formation of the capitalist spirit. More especially, Weber documents the mode in which American business enterprises and the voluntary organizations of American democracy have at least some of their roots in the sectarian culture of Baptist, Quaker, Pietist, Methodist, and other religious denominations. 39 Weber points out that although Europeanization and its accompanying secular attitudes are having a growing influence on American life, church affiliation remains strong. The majority of Anglophone Americans belong to a church that caters to their religious needs, yet also functions as a social club to provide a range of educative, athletic, and other services. Crucially, too, church membership is a visible demonstration of financial and commercial probity. Being a Baptist or a Quaker says more than "I am a believer." It says, "I am honest, scrupulous, and can be relied on to charge fair prices to everyone, and to pay my debts should I ever incur them in a timely and expeditious fashion." Because church membership confers on its members an ethical imprimatur, a certificate of moral qualification that is simultaneously good for business, it comes to be highly valued by those who want to get ahead. By the same token, the church community must ensure that its members maintain high ethical standards, for failure to do so will damage the credibility of the group as a whole. Penalties for miscreants must be swift and unbending. Those who belong to these churches and those who seek entry to them must prove to their fellows, rather than to themselves, as in Weber's discussion of the Protestant ethic, that they are worthy of membership. They must continually and indefatigably attest by their actions that they are meticulous, hardworking, punctilious, and disciplined in their vocation. The spirit of capitalism is significantly shaped by these forces. Whereas in the first part of the article, Weber uses the term church rather loosely, in the second part he seeks to clarify an important distinction. For on his account, what are habitually referred to as American churches, both by commentators and by members themselves, are analytically speaking better comprehended as sects. A sect, in Weber's terminology, is different from a church, for instance, Lutheran or Catholic, in a number of ways. While a church is, in principle, an institution that ministers and dispenses sacraments to all damned and saved alike who happen, usually by birth, to fall under its jurisdiction, a sect is a free community of individuals, restricted to those who pass certain tests of religious purity. Churches are inclusive, ascriptive, obligatory organizations, typically characterized by a formal, hierarchically structured administration. Where they can, churches seek to have their authority bolstered by becoming the compulsory confession of state. Sects, conversely, are exclusive, voluntary communities of the religiously qualified, governed by a network of peers, moral police. Weber calls them 40 who closely inspect the conduct of fellow members and whose principal political demand is freedom from state regulation or interference. Sects are not necessarily small in the total number of believers they comprise. However, the limitations they impose on membership typically do conduce to miniaturization and promote a level of collegiality among believers and a degree of collective scrutiny, unmatched in larger, more anonymous, less discriminating church organizations. 41 Weber argues that the American Baptists, Quakers, Pietists, Methodists, and other denominations with a Puritan background approximate to sects rather than to churches, and that American professional and business life has been effectively modeled on a sectarian basis. Although the old religious convictions of the Puritans are replaced increasingly by the instrumental manners and attitudes typical of the association, the sectarian emphasis on public respectability and exclusiveness survives in American business clubs and professional life. The thread that connects Puritan denominations and modern business associations is the common requirement of members that they prove their worth. In both, social acceptance by one's peers is deemed the sine qua non of success and advancement. Moreover, the struggle to prove oneself is of a highly personal, individual kind, albeit conducted within the context of a tightly controlled social group. As such, Weber argues, it facilitates and promotes the anti-authoritarian thrust of Puritan societies. American democracy is the beneficiary of a movement that puts obedience to God ahead of obedience to the state, freeing the individual of deference to traditional office and encouraging personal dynamism and initiative. Who would have guessed when the Protestant ethic first appeared in 1905 that it would eventually come to be ranked as one of the great texts of the 20th century, selling several 100,000 copies in the process. Certainly not its English publisher, who, in 1934, doubted the translation would sell as many as 2,542, to explain why such pessimism was misplaced. It is worth briefly examining the interaction between the text and its critical reception. 43 Consider, first, the Protestant ethic's cultural resonance. Weber's essay deals with some of the most intriguing and pressing issues of modern times: the nature of capitalism, the character of religion, the future of humanity encased in a shell as hard as steel. Moreover, as Genther Roth and others have argued, Weber's enthusiasm for Puritanism and British and American democracy was particularly congruent with and flattering to the self-image of Anglophone countries. His analysis helped reinforce the American Orthodox understanding of an inherent connection between Protestantism and liberal democracy. 44. At the same time, the essay's strongly counterintuitive propositions on the affinity between Protestantism, a religious movement, and capitalism, an ostensibly secular and godless economic order, offered much to chew on, inviting repudiation as much as acceptance. Indeed, without such a critical reception, the Protestant ethic thesis would have simply degenerated into a platitude, a social science museum piece, unread because uninteresting. Instead, it became a nodal point in a network of competing arguments about capitalism, the greatest economic and cultural force of modern times. Located in a prestigious German journal of social science, Weber's analysis was well placed to provoke criticism and thus attention. And so it did. From the beginning, the Protestant ethic was attacked as theoretically confused, imaginatively fanciful, and historically wrong. Furthermore, the dissent aired in Weber's lifetime notably by Fischer, Rachfal, Sombart, and Brentano. 45, dilated on themes that have haunted the essay ever since. 46. The essay was criticized for overestimating the importance of religious motives and of the Protestant petite bourgeoisie in the emergence of capitalism. Conversely, for underestimating the significance of Catholic, pre-Reformation merchants and bankers as vehicles of capitalism. Relatedly, for failing to see that the matrix of attitudes, habits, and motivations that Weber labeled the spirit of capitalism, and hence of a modern capitalist calling, preceded the likes of Benjamin Franklin by 4 centuries, for instance, in the shape of the Catholic Florentine merchant Leon Battista Alberti. Further objections concerned Weber's one-sided etymology and interpretation of beruf, calling, vocation, and the theoretical weight he accorded it. His failure to reconcile convincingly the strongly anti-mammonistic attitudes of the Puritans with what he claimed to be their role as an unwitting capitalist vanguard. And his inability to see the striking parallels between Jewish and Puritan asceticism, and to acknowledge more generally that it is the status of being socially and politically marginal, more than the existence of peculiar religious or ethical beliefs. That explains why some groups are bearers of innovation, while others cling to tradition. Weber contested vigorously all these objections, asserting either that they represented a caricature of his position. 47, or attested to the critics' own incompetence as historians. Often he claimed both simultaneously. Since his answers appear at length in this volume, readers can make up their own minds as to their plausibility or otherwise. As they do so, it will immediately become apparent that the Weber ritually evoked in textbooks of social science has experienced a remarkable metamorphosis. Gone is the apostle of restraint, sobriety, and value freedom. In his place glowers an entirely different being, a pugnacious literary street fighter who seems to have flourished in an epoch before the social contract was signed. Weber's polemical replies nasty, brutish, though none too short, take no hostages. Felix Rachfal is not simply mistaken in Weber's view. He is benighted, pathetic, dishonest, and wrong in every way, a charlatan egregiously seeking to misrepresent Weber's analysis. Granted, Weber's interlocutor has a fine line in sarcasm himself, relishing the fact that the bubble on the Neckar has burst. 48. Even so, a perusal of Rachfal's own essays shows that Weber's damning indictment of his scholarship is absurd and unfair. Weber's scathing responses raised considerably the temperature of the debate, and his subsequent replies to Sombart and Brentano, though more civil, are just as apodictic. Henceforth, authors who wanted to propose their own distinctive theories of the origins of modern capitalism could do no better than to confront the Weber thesis, and by so doing, locate themselves in a major intellectual controversy. Weber's argument became both a totem to which scholars paid deference every time they attacked it, thereby acknowledging its stature, and a medium through which they could argue against each other, helping to promote a value-added spiral of information, theory, and nuance. The same applies to Weber's later claims about the unique genesis of Western institutions, which have provoked both dissent and qualified support from those concerned to debate Orientalism and Asian values. 49 disputes over a text, then, are vital for its discursive longevity. Simple endorsement would place the Protestant ethic in the mausoleum of social science, not at its commanding heights. So long as it is argued over, particularly by some of the best minds in contemporary social science, the essay emerges perennially revitalized. Reports of its death are seriously exaggerated. 50 Still, cultural resonance will only take a text so far. To join the pantheon of literary works that are commonly called classics, Weber's essay also had to possess qualities of fruitful ambiguity or textual suppleness, which allow multiple readings and adoptions. And such creative engagement was greatly facilitated in the case of the Protestant Ethic 51, both by the fact that the essay exists in two versions, interspersed by the polemical rejoinders to Fisher and Rachfal, and by its complex relationship to the totality of Weber's mature writings on capitalism and religion. In addition, the work contains an intriguing metaphor, Stahlhart's Jehus, or shell as hard as steel, that Talcott Parsons rendered as the iron cage. The translation is questionable, its impact undeniable, for the iron cage has become one of the key topoi of the human sciences, versatile enough to animate investigations ranging from scientific management 52 to the men's movement 53, or to invite literary pun, as in Michael Roth's The Ironist's Cage and Oxymoron, as in Ian Gamble's Hayek, The Iron Cage of Liberty. More generally, such tropes, and the complex arguments in which they are embedded, allow commentators to interpret the Protestant ethic from radically different perspectives. For instance, is the essay primarily a contribution to a universal history of rationality 54, or a study of the genesis of modern Western humanity, and the specialized modes of life peculiar to it 55, is it advancing a strong thesis in which Calvinist ideas were necessary, though not sufficient? Condition of the outlook of modern capitalism, or a weak thesis in which Calvinism was simply consistent with the capitalist spirit, and did nothing to impede it. 56, is the text less about the origins of the capitalist mentality than about the manner in which strata that were already capitalist adopted ideas and attitudes that lent their activity a spectacular dynamism. 57 questions and arguments like these are not arbitrary impositions on Weber's texts, but rather derive from properties central to them. Consider, for instance, Weber's much debated description of the link between the Protestant ethic and the capitalist spirit, or at least of one of its components. Sometimes that connection appears causal, a relationship between an independent and dependent variable, at other times logical, while on still other occasions, Weber describes the relationship as one of adequacy, elective affinity, meaningful congruence, or correspondence. Then again, it is difficult to know what historical weight Weber actually accords the Protestant ethic in the development of capitalism. When critics point to ambiguities in one text, Weber claims indignantly that he has clarified those problems in another. When the same critics charge him with philosophical idealism, Weber reminds them of his distinction between the spirit of capitalism, its moral attitudes and motivations, and the capitalist institutional form or system that encompasses economic, political, juridical, and scientific conditions. Such causal pluralism may be admirable as a methodological postulate, but rhetorically, it allows Weber to constantly elude refutation. 58. Little wonder that critics have charged him with evasion and considered his use of ideal types to be a kind of mental alchemy. What we have been calling the textual suppleness of the Protestant ethic directs an audience toward questions about the narrative itself. Attention is focused on what the text really means, how it is related to other works of Weber's oeuvre, what its author was seeking to do in composing them. But for Weber's writings on Protestantism to have become seminal, they needed to do more than raise hermeneutical questions. They needed also to invite creative application to a host of issues beyond their immediate purview. We have already noted an example of such reader appropriation, the tendency of writers on themes such as the iron cage or Orientalism and Asian values to pick up, even if polemically, Weber's arguments. In addition, Weber's writings on Protestantism and capitalism have been employed to examine such diverse phenomena as the nature of social action, the character of trust relationships, the clash of civilizations, and the dangers of mass consumption, and to explain why some nations became wealthy while others remained poor. 60 such applications, engagements, and creative misreadings of Weber's essay testify to its continuing hold over the scholarly imagination. This is not the place for an extended analysis of the Protestant ethic's national reception. Its trajectory in Britain, for instance, was very different from that in Japan. 61, but one understudied case is particularly instructive. We have seen how Weber sought to understand the United States during his sojourn of 1904. How has the United States sought to understand him? To some degree, the reception of the Protestant ethic in America parallels that in other Anglophone countries. Historians and economists have in general been the least sympathetic to its argument, sociologists the most enthusiastic. But the American case is especially interesting because of its pioneering character and the diversity of its interlocutors. To be sure, the Protestant ethic was already a topic of discussion of British historians in the interwar years, as it was among French luminaries, such as Maurice Halbwatz, Henry Payern, and Henry C. In 1926, R. H. Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism criticized Weber's argument, among other things, for conflating Calvinism and Puritanism, while in 1933, H. M. Robertson's Aspects of the Rise of Economic Individualism. A criticism of Max Weber and his school taxed Weber for misunderstanding Reformed attitudes toward economic activity and for failing to see that Catholicism, particularly its Jesuit inflection, was more conducive to the capitalist spirit than Calvinism was. Yet the American contribution was distinctive in a number of important ways. To begin with, it was two Americans, the University of Chicago economist Frank H. Knight and Talcott Parsons, 63, an economics instructor at Amherst College and at Harvard University before assuming the persona of a sociologist, who first translated Weber's work on Protestantism and capitalism, thereby making it accessible to a growing Anglophone public. 64 of particular significance was Parsons' translation of the Protestant ethic. Published in 3065, which, until 2166, was the only version available for English-language readers to peruse. In consequence, Weber was refracted through a peculiarly Parsonian lens. Parsons, it is true, was the very opposite of a parochial thinker. As an undergraduate at Amherst College, he majored in biology and philosophy before proceeding in the mid-1920s to study economics and sociology, first at the London School of Economics, then in Weber's home city, Heidelberg, where he became personally acquainted with Karl Mannheim, Alfred Weber, Max Weber's brother, Marion Weber, and Karl Jaspers. Of all American sociologists of the 20th century, few have known European continental traditions better than Parsons. At the same time, his translation of the Protestant ethic entailed a domestication of Max Weber's ideas with far-reaching outcomes. Gisela Hinkle has remarked on the Americanization of Max Weber, to which Parsons contributed, by which she means an interpretive transformation of Weber's writings through the process of translation. Translation from one language to another, she adds, and more specifically from one intellectual and linguistic context to another, entails not merely a substitution of words but a transformation of ideas, styles of thinking, modes of expression, indeed a whole context of mental imagery and assumptions. 67. Her concern is that a clash of philosophical perspectives between translators and authors can have major consequences for the latter, pulling a work into an interpretive orbit that disturbs the original constellation of themes, idioms, and emphases. A salient example occurs in the Protestant ethic, where Parsons' hostility to behaviorist psychology and his determination to enlist Weber in the pantheon of thinkers similarly averse to it lead him to downplay Weber's emphasis on psychological drives, impulses, rendering this term as sanctions. Similarly, Parsons translates elective affinities, Wahlverwandtschaften, as correlations, a social scientific idiom that extinguishes the compressed imagery of eroticism, attraction, and alchemy that pervade the Goethean evocation. Another instance occurs toward the end of the Protestant ethic, where Parsons substitutes last stage of cultural development for last men, die letzten Menschen, thereby obliterating the Nietzschean resonance of the original. But Parsons did more than translate Weber's key text on Protestantism. In The Structure of Social Action, 1937, 68 Weber, together with Alfred Marshall, Vilfredo Pareto, and Emil Durkheim, is employed in an ambitious project to reconstruct what Parsons claimed to be a single body of systematic theoretical reasoning on social action. Transcending utilitarianism and idealism alike, Parsons' voluntaristic theory of action became the first stage of his evolution towards structural functionalism, the school of thought that dominated American sociology in the 1950s. As Parsons rose to fame in American sociology, so did Weber, a coupling reinforced by Parsons' co-translation of Part 1 of Weber's Economy and Society, first published in 1947 and again evincing a distinctly Parsonian theoretical bent. 69. More significantly for our purposes, The Structure of Social Action represented Parsons' attempt, only partially successful in the longer term, to reorganize, simplify, and distill the great diversity of sociological thought into a fundamental common core. In the process, Weber was elevated to one of sociology's few canonical thinkers, the Protestant ethic, to one of the disciplines. Jules 70, a contrast of Parsons' approach with that of Pitirim A. Sorokin 71, is telling. Sorokin, Parsons' older rival at Harvard, 72, not only divided sociological theory into a plethora of schools that scattered dozens of thinkers across a broad and heterogeneous horizon, the place afforded to Weber was respectful but comparatively small. In Sorokin's Contemporary Sociological Theories, 1928, Weber appears as a representative of psychosociologistic theories of religion, along with, for instance, the largely forgotten Benjamin Kidd. By contrast, Parsons' stratagem was to raise Weber head and shoulders above the multitudes discussed by Sorokin by treating him as part of a major revolution in the scientific analysis of social phenomena. Parsons was not interested in an intellectual history of sociology that would explore its many precursors and branches. His approach was to move toward synthesis, omitting thinkers whose work was peripheral and integrating the insights of those who were taking the social sciences forward. There is an elevated range of thinkers, Parsons acknowledged in his preface to the second edition of Structure, not just three peaks Pareto, Durkheim, and Weber, but these peaks loom far higher than the lesser ones. For Durkheim and Weber, at least, that judgment has been fully vindicated by the passing of time, and in some interpretations of 20th century thought, Parsons has replaced Pareto as one of sociology's classic thinkers. 74. Moreover, various cohorts of Parsons' students played a major role in the American transmission of the Protestant ethic thesis. Robert K. Merton pushed it further to examine the relationship between Puritanism and modern science. Robert Bella used it to reevaluate the extent to which traditional Japanese institutions and religions were favorable to economic efficiency and development. Randall Collins sought to relocate it in Weber's multicausal theory of capitalism, and more generally, placed Weber in the same conflict tradition as Marx. 75. In all these cases, the authors did not seek to defend Weber's original argument so much as to creatively adapt or extrapolate aspects of it to related problems. As such, whatever other problems their work raised, they were free of the anathema often attached to writers who, vaguely or otherwise, sought to apply Weber's analysis to contemporary American society. 76, surveying a number of these attempts in a paper first delivered to the American Catholic Sociological Society in August 1963. Andrew Greeley claimed that all the evidence available offered not the slightest confirmation for the theory that Protestants are more achievement-oriented than Catholics in American society. Historians, too, have been overwhelmingly skeptical. Had the Protestant ethic been read mainly by historians, its influence on American thought would have been marginal. Most have found the thesis unconvincing or outdated, decisively surpassed by later Reformation research, and largely irrelevant to the history of industrialization. 78 economists, congenitally ill-disposed toward cultural accounts of economic phenomena, have typically granted Weber's thesis a certain inventiveness, but deemed it peripheral to disciplinary paradigms. Even those among their number, like Joseph Schumpeter, who took a generous view of the mutually fecund relations between economics and sociology, and most of his colleagues emphatically did not, gave the impression that the Protestant ethic was a road unwisely taken. Schumpeter called it an example of spurious problems, that is to say, problems that the analyst himself creates by his own method of procedure, in this case, the formulation of an ideal type of the new spirit of capitalism. Alas, Schumpeter contended, there was no such entity, in the sense that people would have had to acquire a new way of thinking in order to be able to transform a feudal economic world into a wholly different capitalist one. So soon as we realize that pure feudalism and pure capitalism are equally unrealistic creations of our own mind, the problem of what it was that turned the one into the other vanishes completely. The society of the feudal ages contained all the germs of the society of the capitalist age. These germs developed by slow degrees, each step teaching its lesson and producing another increment of capitalist methods and of capitalist spirit. Similarly, there was no such thing as a new spirit of free inquiry whose emergence would call for explanation. The scholastic science of the Middle Ages contained all the germs of the laical science of the Renaissance. 79. The point of quoting Schumpeter at length is not to endorse uncritically his depiction of Weber's procedure or his conclusions, but only to show that even a potentially tolerant observer from economics expressly disowned the thesis. Sociology, we saw previously, has been much more favorable to the Protestant ethic, and not only because of the discipline's bias toward cultural types of explanation. One reason is a tendency toward highly ritualized citation and summary, reinforced by the fact that sociologists are in the main professionally unequipped to make historically discriminating judgments. Another is the disciplinary firewall erected by specialization and compartmentalization, shielding sociologists from the criticisms of colleagues in history and economics. But that is only part of the picture. The Protestant ethic has perennially survived in American sociology and in other national traditions, too, not because of its ostensible veracity 80, but because of its utility. Its protean aptitude, sketched above, to act as a catalyst of hypotheses or vehicle of multiple projects that have little to do with the impulse that originally animated it. Weber is found, for instance, wherever theories of modernization 81 are debated or wherever Marx's flag is hoisted. In the latter case, Weber can be counted on to lead the retaliatory assault on the Marxian citadel, notwithstanding the fact that in many respects he found fruitful an economic interpretation of history. Or to put the matter differently, sociology continues to accord the Protestant ethic a singular standing not because of its putative historical accuracy, but because of what it permits sociologists to do, and Project 80 to it is the essay's suggestiveness, not its ultimate verisimilitude, its pliability, not its irrefutability, that keeps it alive. It was observed previously that the first two major translations of Weber's work came from American hands. In fact, practically all the book-length translations of Weber's studies of sociology, law, economics, method, politics, and religion up to 1990 were likewise produced under American auspices. 83 So too was the first major Anglophone commentary, Max Weber. An Intellectual Portrait, 1959-84, penned by Reinhard Bendix, a Berliner who had immigrated to the United States in 1938 and who, until his death in 1991, remained America's foremost Weberian sociologist. Bendix's base at Berkeley from 1947 onward, first in the Department of Sociology and later in the Department of Political Science, and Parsons at Harvard, nicely epitomizes what became known as coastal sociology, the dominant centers of the East and the West. Still, undoubtedly, the most influential text, after the Protestant ethic, for the American reception of Weber came not from California or Massachusetts, but from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Maryland. The collaboration between Hans H. Girth and C. Wright Mills that produced from Max Weber, Essays in Sociology. That anthology, which contained Weber's companion piece to the Protestant ethic, The Protestant Sects and the Spirit of Capitalism, helped launch the career of Mills, and with it an alternative reading of Weber. For Mills, Weber was quintessentially the theorist of modern history and of power relations, a pulverizing battering ram against Parsonian grand theory, and a vital contributor to the sociological imagination. An imagination that enables its possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. 85 Girth and Mills's tormented partnership in producing what has become the most widely read compendium of Weber's works is one of the more fascinating stories of scholarly collaboration. 86 For our purposes here, however, it is sufficient to recall that Girth was among a group of talented scholars. It included Leo Strauss, Emil Lederer, Hans Speyer, Adolf Lwe, Arnold Brecht, Hans Morgenthau, and Erich Fromm, who brought Weber to America as a consequence of the great German cultural emigration of the 1930s and 1940s. In the process, Weber was adapted, filtered, applied, and reshaped to make him intelligible to American pragmatic and religious sensibilities. Albert Salaman, from his base at the New School of Social Research in New York City, was an early cultural mediator. 87 Hannah Arendt, robustly anti-Weberian on most dimensions, nonetheless paid tribute to the greatness of the Protestant ethic. 88 addressing himself to an American audience on the parlous state of German academic social sciences during the first third of the 20th century, Franz Newman, the legal scholar, advocate, and critical theorist who had made America his home in 1936, noted one sterling exception, Max Weber, whose name is known and honored wherever social and political science is taught. Weber's greatness consists in a unique combination of a theoretical frame, although for me of doubtful validity, a mastery of a tremendous number of data, and a full awareness of the political responsibility of the scholar. Newman, writing in 1953, went on to say that while Weber's influence in Germany was very limited, it is here, in the United States, that Weber really came to life, to which one is compelled to add, much to the chagrin of some Americans. Almost 35 years after Newman's encomium, Alan Bloom indicted Weber as one of the principal miscreants responsible for the closing of the American mind. Weber's sin, Bloom thundered, was to be a chief purveyor of cultural relativism and decisionism, a siren voice proclaiming the age of disenchantment and rationalization, substituting a concern for reason and good and evil with a hodgepodge of warring, incommensurable, freely chosen values. Weber reaffirmed the legacy of Nietzsche. Indeed, the transfusion of this myth-making or value-positing interpretation of social and political experience into the American bloodstream was in large measure affected by Max Weber's language. His success here is, I am tempted to say, miraculous. A good example is his invention, the Protestant ethic. Weber's treatment of the Calvinists, Bloom claimed, was symptomatic of a more general nihilism. Denying the essential rationality of human values, Weber saw the Calvinists' convictions as no more than worldviews or world interpretations imposed on a chaotic world by powerful personalities. For Bloom, probably Strauss's 90 most famous disciple, such an interpretation was a travesty, a denial of reason as well as God. Yet in spite of it, the Weberian language and the interpretation of the world it brings with it have caught on like wildfire. 91. There are no signs that the flames are yet extinguished. The Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism has been described by the sociologist Daniel Bell as probably the most important sociological work of the 20th century. 92. While the American intellectual historian H. Stuart Hughes has called it one of the great works of the social thought of our time, an almost unique combination of imaginative boldness in its central hypothesis and meticulous scholarship in its documentation. Few essays of social science are more daring, stimulating, and interesting. Modern scholarship has subjected the text to a constant barrage of critical attack, yet it has survived to be read and reread. The matrix of problems with which it deals retains an interest and pathos that are likely to endure, and behind the essay stands a man of remarkable qualities and paradoxes. The last encyclopedic genius of the 20th century still awaits a biography that can do justice to his prodigious versatility. The problem is not only that we moderns lack Weber's range, it is also that a culture of specialists without addendum on the 1905 and 1920 versions of the Protestant ethic. We noted that the Protestant ethic exists in both an original 1905 and a revised 1920 form. The latter version, completed shortly before Weber's death, was the one that Talcott Parsons drew on in his English translation of